They had endured endless nights of hunger, watched loved ones disappear, and carried the weight of fear that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Every day was a test of survival, every moment a battle against exhaustion and despair. And yet, after everything they had suffered, they were met with something so astonishing, so completely unimaginable, that it left them speechless, as if the world they thought they knew had shifted beneath their feet. One moment, they were prisoners of a war that had stolen everything, and the next, they were faced with an act that challenged everything they had come to expect. It was in that moment, sitting quietly and feeling the pain that reminded her of every hardship endured, that she whispered words that would haunt her memory forever. "It hurts when I sit." How could this be? How could something so simple carry the weight of a story no one could have prepared for? The women we are about to meet had already endured more than most could imagine. Taken from their homes, torn from their families, and confined within the harsh walls of prisoner-of-war camps, they carried the scars of a world consumed by conflict. It was late 1945, the war in the Pacific had left cities in ruins, and countless lives had been reshaped by violence, hunger, and fear. These Japanese women, once ordinary citizens, had become witnesses to the extremes of human suffering. And yet, even as the war drew to a close, a question lingered over every interaction, every passing moment in the camp: could human decency survive in a world that had stripped so many of their humanity? What awaited them in the hands of the Americans, who had conquered their oppressors, would test not only their endurance but their understanding of compassion in a place where kindness was as rare as hope itself. To understand what these women endured, we must first step back and look at the world they were born into, a world consumed by war. Across Japan, cities lay in ruins from relentless bombings, food was scarce, and families were fractured. For the civilians, every day was a battle against hunger, illness, and fear. For those who fell into the hands of the enemy, the situation was even grimmer. Prisoner-of-war camps were crowded and cold, often lacking basic necessities. Illness spread quickly, medical care was minimal or absent, and starvation gnawed at both body and spirit. Imagine waking each day, not knowing if you would receive even a single meal, and yet being forced to endure harsh labor, inspection, and the constant watch of soldiers who had the power to make life unbearable. Letters home were censored or never sent, leaving families in despair, waiting for news that might never come. In the quiet moments, many of these women kept diaries, scratching down memories of a life that seemed so far away, clinging to fragments of hope amidst the suffering. One young woman wrote simply, "The nights are the hardest. Hunger follows me into my dreams, and still, I am expected to rise and face the day with a smile." These words, unremarkable at first glance, reveal the quiet courage of ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of endurance. And it was into this world, already stripped of comfort and certainty, that the arrival of American soldiers would bring a moment that none of them could have imagined. The moment that would make her whisper, over and over, "It hurts when I sit." When the war finally caught up to them, these women were taken from everything they had known. Families, homes, familiar streets, all vanished behind the walls of the prison camp. The journey itself was grueling, a blur of crowded trains, harsh orders, and the uncertainty that clawed at every step. Upon arrival, the camp revealed itself in stark detail: barracks that smelled of damp wood and illness, fences topped with barbed wire that cut the sky, guards whose expressions gave nothing away. Every glance, every command carried weight, and every misstep could mean punishment. For many, the first hours were the hardest, the moment the reality of captivity sank in, heavier than any physical blow. Hunger bit at their stomachs, cold seeped into their bones, and exhaustion blurred the line between night and day. Their expectations of what captivity might be, often shaped by stories, rumors, or hope, collapsed immediately. They had imagined strict orders and discipline, yes, but they had never anticipated the harshness, the small cruelties, or the indifference to suffering. And yet, amidst the despair, moments of quiet humanity began to emerge in ways they could scarcely believe. A guard might pass a small piece of bread, or an American soldier might approach with concern for their injuries. These glimpses of care were as shocking as the cruelty they had endured, leaving the women torn between disbelief and gratitude. Many recorded their early days in whispered diary entries, capturing the fear and confusion that marked each morning. One wrote, "I do not know who to fear the most, the ones who shout, or the silence that follows. Yet, a stranger's hand, offering something as small as water, feels as strange as sunlight in winter." It was these first weeks, these first shocks to both body and spirit, that set the stage for the story that would follow, a story so unexpected, so beyond what they could have imagined, that it would leave them whispering, "It hurts when I sit." Every step, every glance, every quiet act within the camp would build toward that moment, and the women would remember it forever as a point where the unimaginable became real. As the days stretched on within the camp, the women began to notice a change that no one had expected. American soldiers, representatives of the force that had defeated their captors, entered their world with a mix of authority and uncertainty. For these soldiers, the war had left them exhausted, scarred by years of combat, yet confronted now with prisoners whose lives had been stripped bare, they were forced to make choices that tested their own humanity. At first, the women watched cautiously, unsure whether these men were simply another form of control, another layer of fear. But slowly, actions began to speak louder than suspicion. A soldier might kneel beside one of the women, carefully examining a wound, offering water or a blanket. A name could be heard in gentle conversation: Lieutenant Harris, Private Thompson, soldiers whose rank and uniform carried power, yet whose gestures revealed an unexpected care. The women, conditioned to fear, found themselves frozen by the incongruity. These were the same people who could command obedience, yet here they were, treating them with a consideration that seemed almost impossible. The tension in every interaction was immense. One misstep could undo any moment of kindness, yet each act of care quietly chipped away at the walls of distrust. A soldier administering medicine would pause, eyes meeting theirs, silently weighing duty against conscience, obedience against empathy. For the women, these moments were shocking. The reality of compassion in a place defined by suffering was something they could scarcely process. Among the daily routines of inspection and labor, small gestures began to accumulate. Extra food quietly handed during roll call, blankets draped over trembling shoulders, careful attention to injuries that had festered for months. Each act was a reminder of how fragile human decency could appear, and how extraordinary it could feel when given. They began to whisper among themselves, half in disbelief, half in hope, sensing that something beyond survival was unfolding, something that would linger in memory long after the war ended. And yet, beneath these gestures, there was a tension neither side could ignore. The soldiers were bound by orders, by discipline, by the structure of an army that demanded both strength and restraint. Each decision to help, each moment of hesitation, carried weight, the consequences hidden but real. For the women, every touch, every glance, every word became part of a growing puzzle. How could people who had once been enemies offer such care, such attention to pain that had been endured for years? It was during this period of quiet observation, of moments that seemed almost impossible, that the memory of her pain, the lingering injuries, the wounds that no one had properly treated, remained. And it was in the midst of a simple act of medical care, a touch meant to heal, that the weight of every day, every hardship, finally surfaced. The moment was quiet, almost ordinary, yet it carried a force that made her whisper words she would never forget: "It hurts when I sit." That phrase, unremarkable to the world outside, encapsulated a lifetime of suffering, a mixture of relief and lingering agony, a truth that only those who had survived could understand. In the days that followed, the camp settled into a quiet routine, but the struggle had not eased. The injuries these women carried were not the kind that disappeared with a single bandage or a moment of rest. Many had gone months without proper medical care. Bones that had healed poorly now ached with every movement. Muscles had weakened from hunger and heavy labor. The simplest motion could send pain across the body like a silent reminder of everything they had endured. Yet the physical injuries were only one part of their burden. The emotional weight was just as deep, shaped by memories they could not leave behind. There were moments when the women sat together in silence, each one lost in her own thoughts. Some remembered their families. Others thought of the lives they once lived, the streets they once walked, the small daily comforts that felt so distant now. For many, the treatment they now received from the American soldiers brought feelings they could not explain. There was relief in being seen, in being helped, in knowing that someone cared whether their wounds healed. But there was also confusion. Gratitude mixed with uncertainty. They had been taught to view these men as enemies, figures to be feared, avoided, or hated. Now, those same men were tending to their pain and giving what little supplies they could spare. This contradiction settled heavily in the heart. To receive kindness from the hands of those once believed to be dangerous was something difficult to understand. Some felt shame for accepting help. Some felt hesitation. Some felt a quiet sense of hope, though they would never admit it aloud. In a small journal, pages worn thin from being handled in secret, one woman wrote, "I do not know how to speak about these days. I feel as though my mind is walking two paths at once. There is pain that does not leave me, but there are moments now when someone looks at me with concern, and I do not know how to respond. I sit when I must, but it hurts, and I remember everything." Another wrote to her sister, though the letter would never be sent. "We are surviving. I cannot say more. My body is slow to heal, and when I sit, the pain reminds me of what has happened. But there are people here who try to help. I do not know what to call this feeling." The camp was quiet at night. The guards moved through the shadows. The women rested where they could. Yet the air was filled with something that had not existed before, an uncertainty that came not from fear, but from the unfamiliar presence of compassion. Could you imagine surviving all of this, everything taken, everything changed, and then facing something you could never have expected? A moment where the world did not match what you had been taught to believe. This was the struggle that filled their days now. Not only to endure the pain that remained, but to understand the hands that tried to ease it. And that struggle would lead them closer to the moment that would be remembered long after the camp gates opened again, the moment that would echo in the quiet words, spoken softly through pain and memory. "It hurts when I sit." She sat on the small wooden bench, the kind that looked as though it had been hammered together in a hurry. No cushion. No cloth. Just wood, rough, uneven, unkind to anyone who'd been living on rations barely enough to keep a heartbeat steady. The American medic kneeled beside her. His hands did not rush. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched her try to adjust her posture, how her shoulders tightened each time she tried to lower herself. The women behind her stayed quiet, unsure whether to step forward or to disappear into the background of the room. She tried again. The moment her weight settled, a sharp breath escaped her lips. Not a cry. Not a complaint. Just a sudden, involuntary sound of pain. And that was when he finally understood. The issue wasn't her back, or her hips, or anything visible at first glance. It was the long months of untreated pressure sores, the kind that formed when a person had no padding left on their bones. When the body had been without real food for so long that sitting became an injury in itself. In their old camp, no one would have stopped to ask why she flinched. Pain had become something you carried quietly, like your shadow. But here, someone was trying to understand it. The medic glanced at the supplies laid out on the table. Cotton. Ointment. Bandages. Items so ordinary in his world, yet to her, they looked foreign, like artifacts from a life she once remembered but no longer trusted. He said only 3 words. Words that did not ask for explanation. Words that did not question her strength. "Let me help." Her eyes did not meet his. She kept them lowered. Not because of shame, but because she didn't know what happens next. In captivity, every action had a consequence. Every gesture had a cost. She waited for the hidden price, the command, the tone change, the expected cruelty. But it never came. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the worn fabric of her clothing, revealing what starvation had carved into her. The room stayed silent. Even the other soldiers, who had seen battlefield wounds, gunfire, burns, shifted their stance. This pain had taken no shrapnel. No bullets. Just time. Time and hunger. When the ointment touched her skin, she winced again. A quiet sound. A reminder that healing could hurt too. One of the women watching whispered, barely louder than breath. "It hurts when I sit." Not as a complaint. As a fact of her life. A truth she had carried for months without speaking aloud. And in that moment, the room changed. The soldiers, who had arrived with orders and discipline, found themselves facing something different, a kind of suffering they had not been trained to answer. There was no manual for this. No checklist. No uniform that told them how to respond. Just people. People who had survived more than anyone had realized. And the act itself, the simple tending of wounds, became the moment that stayed with all of them long after the war ended. No speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest shock is kindness, arriving where none was expected. The bench remained the same. The room remained the same. But she did not. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone was trying to give pain a place to leave. When the war finally ended, the women were no longer the same as the day they entered captivity. Their bodies needed time, months, years in some cases, to return to something close to strength. Food was reintroduced carefully, measured spoonfuls at first so their organs would not fail. Some walked again without pain. Some learned to sleep without waking at every sound. Some never fully recovered. But healing was not only in muscle or skin. Many of them spoke later of the moment they realized they were being treated as human beings again. It did not come all at once. It arrived in small fragments. Someone pouring water without impatience, someone waiting for them to stand at their own pace, someone listening to their voice without demanding anything in return. For the American soldiers who tended to them, the memory also stayed. They had trained to fight an enemy shaped by posters and broadcasts. Yet, face to face, they found women who flinched not from combat, but from hunger, exhaustion, and time spent forgotten. It caused them to question where duty ended and where compassion began. Years later, in letters and memoirs, one of the women described her recovery. She wrote, "When I first sat without pain, I cried. Not because it hurt anymore, but because I finally believed I had survived it." Some attempted to rebuild the lives they had before. Others started new ones entirely. A few met again with the very soldiers who once guarded and treated them, not as captor and captive anymore, but as people with shared memory of a time that reshaped them both. History often divides the war into sides, flags, uniforms. But stories like this show another truth. Even in a world defined by conflict, individuals can choose how they will remember another person. Not as an enemy. Not as an object of war. But as someone who endured, who waited, who tried to live. And that is the lasting mark of this story. Not simply survival. Not suffering alone. But the recognition, at the quiet end of everything, that humanity can appear in the least expected places, and once seen, it cannot be forgotten. So the question remains. If you were in her place, carrying pain without knowing whether help was real or temporary, what would you have done? Stories like this are often left in the shadows of history, remembered only by those who lived them. Yet they reveal something essential about the human experience during war, what people endured, what they lost, and what they managed to hold on to. If this story made you pause, if it made you reconsider what you thought you knew, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps these memories stay alive. There are many more accounts like hers. Some documented. Some tucked inside personal diaries. Some passed quietly through families for generations. Each one offers another window into lives shaped by the conflict. If you would like to hear more of these untold stories, you may choose to subscribe. Here, we continue to uncover the parts of history that rarely reach the textbooks, the moments that reveal who we were, and who we became. Thank you for watching.